Morning, sir. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is, according, yes, sir?
You might mention that Art and Edwina were exposed to the virus again.
Are there any special prayers that need to be offered this morning? John, would you lead us in a word of prayer before we begin, please?
Father in heaven, thank you for this opportunity to be here this morning. Thank you that we got a roof over our heads and that everybody that's here is healthy, and we pray for those that are ill and for those around us that are dealing with COVID. And we pray to show us a recollection of the things that He has prepared, and we have open ears that we can seek ways that we can apply in our lives and draw us closer to you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Ron just informed me that Art and Edwina have been exposed to the virus again. Other than that, I have no information, and I know nothing beyond that. Before we begin, I'd also inform you that this thing is on. And if it rings while we're talking, I'm going to answer it. Well, I'm going to look to see who it is first, of course, but it's my wife, I'm going to answer it. She's indisposed this morning, and if she calls, I'm gone. Okay? It is nothing to do with the virus. She's got no fever. She's got no sore throat. It's nothing of that nature. She's having problems with her legs. And so right now she's functional, but this is the first time in 66 years that I've been in a church assembly when I wasn't traveling in some occasions, that I've been here without my wife. And it ain't nice. Excuse me. We left off last week at just about the conclusion of Paul's dissertation, if you will, on the status of the Gentiles in relation to God. And remember when he stated his theme in chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, he then followed that in verse 18 with a paraphrase. He said, "For the wrath of God." For the wrath of God. And then he went through the delineation of all of those things that the Gentiles had violated. And he was emphasizing then in that for, that the wrath of God was upon them because of these things. That to say, no, I put that in the wrong place, didn't I? Anyway, the word for, whereof, and for, and therefore are used in Romans. I put that note someplace else now, I don't know where I put it. I think 178 times. And it's there to warn us of a completion or a beginning, depending on your attitude about it, that this that I'm about to say is because of or for what has been said before. That's the way Paul ties this whole thing together. And having said that now, so Paul went then from for the wrath of God, and he proceeded to unveil all those things that the Gentiles had been guilty of, and that they had fundamentally been caused by their turn to idolatry after having rejected the things that God had sent for them to do. And so then we come then to 128, chapter 1, verse 128. And it reads as such, And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, they didn't deem it was worthy that the teachings and direction of God, even though it had been revealed properly to them, was worthy to be kept in their minds. And so God gave them over to a reprobate mind. A reprobate mind is one that is rejected by God. It's unworthy of God to consider that mind as long as it's in the condition that it is now. Excuse me. Maybe I'll make it. And he gave them over. By the way, we're going to see that. We have already seen it twice, this phrase, God gave them over, or God gave them up. This is the third time that he's given them up for reasons of their misbehavior, if you will. And so it is an emphasis Paul is given here to understand that we can be given up also, but to teach the lesson that God can do things because of our rejection of him that will allow us to go off into a direction that we have determined to go, given the opportunity then to come back. And he gave them up to do those things which are not convenient, indecent, immoral things that violated God's word and violated themselves in what should have been the service of God. To do those things which are not convenient, those things that are not fitting, indecent and immoral things. And then we go to verse 129, and it begins being filled with all unrighteousness. And Paul is going to delineate some 18 or 19 words that are specifically directed to those things that, and revealed about those things that the Gentiles had done. And I want us to go through each one of those words this morning. I don't want to bore you, but they have instruction as well as meaning. We don't have to be completely engrossed in what these words mean for us not to be participating in them. So let's look at each one of them and see what meanings they had back then, what they would have meant to those folks that opened these books for the first time, and think at the same time how they might apply to us today that would put us out of duty to the God that we would serve. Fornication. In the King James Version, the Greek for that is always used as fornication, and it's used in the same form of speech that's common in the Old Testament and among the Jews, which represent the close relationship existing between Jehovah and his people under the figure of a marriage, and that's the definition from Thayer's Greek lexicon. Fornication is used in the Bible to refer to two types of sin. Its most literal sense refers to any violation of God's law regarding sexual behavior. But fornication on a spiritual level refers, and by the way, the Gentiles had done this on both levels. But fornication at a spiritual level refers to a pagan idolatry, such as that practiced by the nation of Israel, which was pictured as God's wife in the Scriptures. Wickedness. It can be depravity, malice, plots, and sins used in King James to represent iniquity and wickedness. It implies a disposition to do others much harm as possible. It's more active than the unrighteousness in the term that would be used here in this scenario, but it means one who would be satisfied withholding from another what is his due. Wickedness. And the significance of it can be emphasized by realizing that this is the term that was used to describe the devil. It was a name that was given to him, the wicked one. Covetousness. Paul is going to use this word later on in his examples of the Jews. But today, in reference to the Gentiles, in the King James Version, it can be, the Greek word here can use as covetous practices or greediness, and it denotes the disposition to be discontented at another's good fortune, jealous, an inordinate desire to accumulate property regardless of the rights of others. Maliciousness, depravity, malignity. In King James, it's evil, naughtiness, wickedness. A readiness to commit crime without provocation, a chronic state of ill will and misanthropy. Misanthropy is a hatred of mankind, a pessimistic distrust of human nature expressed in thought and behavior. You could almost stop and say, how can it get worse? How can it get worse? But it does. Full of envy. The term full of here means to be stuffed full, to be full to overflowing, to the brim in their envy. And envy means the state of mind which begrudges another his excellence or place, and usually causes one to underestimate another so he can be unjust to him. Bad things. And just a simple statement, murder. The willful and malicious taking of human life. And today that includes abortion. Debate. This is an interesting word because the meaning of it has changed. The debate today means just that, and to use the technical description, it's an elucidation for the sake of truth. When the King James Version was made, the word debate meant contention for the sake of contention, the tendency to take opposite views in any matter purely for the sake of wrangling. So it's a different word than it is today. And were I writing this, I would have used strife or contention as opposed to variance. Knowing what I know now, I didn't know any better before. But knowing what I know now, I think I would use that. A negative side, this passage does not forbid the striving for truth today in argumentation, meaning debate or formal debate. But it does condemn the contentious spirit of which the Gentiles were guilty in their deceit. And the next word is deceit. It's meant to be a decoy or a wile, a trick. The King James Version, as they use 4 words, craft, deceit, guile, or subtlety. As a disposition of mind, it means the willingness to use every deceitful means of fraud and subtlety. The devil uses that very often and continuously. We should not. We should not be deceitful. And malignity, mischievous, and a bad character. Bad manner of characters. It combined 2 words there, Greek words, which mean really just an evil disposition that tends to put the worst construction on everything that occurs. Whisperers. A secret calumniator. And, well, that's a neat word, isn't it? To calumniate means to make false and defamatory statements. In the King James Version, it is rendered whisperer, and is people who slander other men secretly. They whisper vile things and tales after another, pretending to be innocent themselves. They tell their tales as if to hurt themselves in telling the tale, but in reality they delight in it. And usually they enjoin others not to mention the fact that they have told these tales. It's all done in secret. Nobody knows. Nobody knows. Backbiters. Talkative against. Now these are the people opposite of the whisperer. They tell openly all the tales and loudly proclaim the faults of others and no disposition on their part to hold back anything, whether truth or false. And in this, they differ from the whisperer, that they do it publicly. They have make no bones about it. Haters of God. Just hateful to God, impious people. Such people hate God because his ways are not the ways they like to follow. They hate him because he disapproves their conduct, and they scorn both God and his ways. Despiteful, proud, boastful. Now, I list these words because these three words describe the self-exaltation that the Gentiles were making of themselves. It was a sin then, it's a sin now. But then it was done even to the point of being used or being proclaimed blasphemy the way that it was done. Inventors of evil things. It can mean worthless, depraved, or injurious, but in the King James Version it also is translated bad, evil, harm, ill, noisome, or wicked. And the description of it is inventors of new methods of evading laws, schemers who discover new ways by which to unjustly accumulate property, discoverers of new forms of sensual lustfulness and physical gratifications. Disobedient to parents. Really self-explanatory, but if we were to get started on that, we could take up the next 4 days talking about it. Let's just leave it at that for that part. Without understanding means unintelligent by implication, to be wicked. In the King James Version, it's used to say foolish or without understanding. Those with a seared conscience that are unable to determine between right and wrong, even in very, very obvious cases. The loss of moral understanding is apparent among habitual liars whose minds have become so accustomed to falsehood that they are no longer able to discern the truth or to accurately state it. Covenant breakers. It can be used in other things than covenant breakers, such as not agreed or treacherous or compacts, but it means those who fail to keep their obligations and promises. Without natural affection, hard-hearted toward kindred. Without natural affection, those having an abnormal lack of love towards parents, children, kindred. And implacable. This, by the way, is an obsolete word. And the meaning of it, of course, is that an act of pouring a liquid as a sacrifice, and as a liquid as used in libation, or an act of instance or drinking, often ceremoniously, meaning that to confirm or to close the act of negotiating, as in truce. And by the way, trucelessness means an marked by unending hostilities and having no hope of a truce. And the implacable then means that they do not perform the ceremonies, they do not approve of it, and they become truceless and not carrying out that which would have been had they properly concluded with the offering of the wine to close the negotiations. Unmerciful. Those who have this quality show no mercy to those who err. Those who are guilty of it have no disposition to forgive. Rather, they tend to remember and hold a grudge and exact the last ounce of blood from one's fellow man, even though they themselves are wicked. I don't know why Paul chose these words, because there are many more that we could select and discuss and define of things that are should be unnormal to one who has dedicated themselves to the life of Christ, to the gospel resulting from the life and death of Christ. But each one of them has a specific application to our knowledge of things that we should not do. We do not have to be completely consumed inside the meaning of these words to be guilty of the basic necessity of that word. We can be fringe and be on the fringe of almost any one of these things and be guilty of it. What it meant to those who were reading Romans for the first time, though, I think Paul's explanation, that's something I shouldn't have said. I think Paul's explanation is sufficient. Paul didn't ask me for me to approve of his explanation, but that's what he told them and left them in that condition. And then he says this in chapter 1, verse 32, who knowing the judgment of God, that they who commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. So Paul closed his argument about the guiltiness of the Gentiles and their need for what he said in verses 16 and 17 to avoid the wrath of God. And, excuse me. Has any of you ever read a gentleman named Lard in his writings? He's a very interesting way of presenting things. I won't spend but just a moment on this because it's really not totally germane to what we're talking about. But Lard, he's extremely dedicated. Yeah, that's good. Extremely dedicated to examining and even questioning the basic meaning of the Greek words used to tell us about these things. And he described the Gentiles like this. They started with the knowledge of God, then they descended to the foolishness of idolatry. And God abandoned them at this point, and then they began a second descent. And they continued in that descent until they reached the very bottom of moral degradation, as indicated in the verses that we have just read, and the description earlier on in verses 22 through 25, talking about what they had gone through in the rejection of God. So, the Gentiles, where are they? Where has Paul left them at this point in getting his point across? God made manifest to them who he was, what he was, but they were rejected 3 times, given over because of what they had done. And that's where they are at this point in the writings of Paul. They had dishonored their bodies. They had gone into idolatry. And they had rejected God. I'd like to read something else to you before we go on here. Paul was also proving through the Gentiles that man, left to himself, does not evolve into something better and higher, but lower and more base. The Gentiles prove that man left to himself sinks into the pits of perversion not to be mentioned in the conduct of God-fearing people. He proved that man left to himself cannot and will not rise, but will fall, unable to live properly, and surely unable to devise a scheme of redemption for himself. And if I may, I would remind ourselves one more time of chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. And that is where the Gentiles were at this point. Any comments or questions about, yes, ma'am?
In that worthy of death, I don't think he's condoning execution there. I think he's talking of the second death that they'll receive.
Say that, say the first part again, I couldn't hear.
I said, I don't think, and when he says worthy of death, I don't think he's condoning execution, a physical death. He's talking about the second death they'll receive in hell.
That the word that's used there is used both in both terms, both senses, both physical and spiritual death. But in the particular place you're talking about, you're absolutely right. He's not talking about physical death.
13.
Sir?
Chapter 13.
Is there 13 chapters?
I think.
Yes. He gets there. He covers all the bases before it's all done. Any other questions or comments? In chapter 2, depending on how you're listening, whether you are before that though, we need to remember, and I catch myself not doing this myself, we need to remember who Paul's talking to. He's talking to the church. He's talking to baptized believers. Why is he using this construct? I still haven't come up with a reasonable description of that myself, but you don't need that anyway. But remember that that's who he's talking to. And so, and included in that are Jews. Maybe that motivated him to do it this way, maybe it didn't. But I say that to say this. From this point on through about chapter 11, maybe, and yes, it is numbered 1 through 13, Bobby. We'll get there. You go on for chapter 7, maybe even to chapter 9. Depending on who you are, how well versed you are even in what's available at that time, Paul writes pretty tough. It can be looked as, depending on where you are, he could be doing a treatise. He could be doing a screed. It's the third word. What's the third word? Diatribe. So you're going to be offended depending on who you are. You're going to be absolutely rejecting it mentally until you get the whole story. If you stay with it for the whole story, because of the way he says some things and because of some things that he says, or in the right mind, it's going to be a treatise. Because, and let me read the formal definition and it'll make more sense. Most of you know it, or all of you probably know it. A systematic exposition or argument in writing, including a methodical discussion of the facts and principles involved and conclusions reached. Now, he's already done that for the Gentiles. And now we're going to go forward. He's going to begin in chapter 2. But I want to violate even one of my own desires before we start. Remember, I asked you when we begin that we're going to look at these things as they occur. But when you begin chapter 2, therefore thou art inexcusable, O man. Left where we were, or are, in Romans at this point, we could apply this even yet to the Gentiles if we began here and went forward. But if we go forward from here without doing something else first in my own mind, I had to keep it clear this way, then we really don't know who he's talking to right here. Is he talking specifically to a Jew? Is he talking to a Gentile? However, If you go to verse 17 in chapter 2, it reads thus, Behold, thou art called a Jew, and restest in the law, and makest thy boast of God. That verse flows backward to verse 1, and he discloses at that point then specifically who he's describing, who he's talking to in these 16 verses before you get there. The reason that I do that is because I didn't want to go through and get to 17 and then have to go back to 1 and fill it out again. So we know who he's talking to beginning right here. And he does this. Therefore thou art inexcusable, O man, whosoever thou art that judgest. I hope you folks don't get tired of this word thing, but no, words are really interesting. That word there, we think of, most of the time, we think of judging as, well, he really isn't doing what he's supposed to. Or any other nomenclature of judging, but this word, and I don't know what one that would be used to be more clear, but this word is more than just judging. It's the whole shebang. It is judge, jury, and sentence. It is a condemnation of that to whom it's addressed. So whoever, O man, is, and we know now that he's talking to the Jews, therefore thou art inexcusable, you Jews, whosoever thou art that judges. So those of you who are condemning to death, if you will, those who are doing like things that you are, which we'll address later on, are at fault. It is not to be done. For wherein thou judgest another, thou condemnest thyself. What does that mean? If I stand here and I hadn't thought to do this, how do you condemn yourself? If I say that you are smoking a cigarette, and you're just the most terrible person, I hope nobody smokes. That's a bad example, but I'm going to stick with it for the moment. You're smoking a cigarette, and that's wrong. We went through a question a little while ago, a couple of days ago, about dishonoring the body. So I'm saying you're smoking a cigarette, you're dishonoring your body because you're doing something to it that is not natural, not normal. And then I say, excuse me, I got to go outside and have a cigarette. I'm having a nicotine fit. What did I just do?
Judge somebody while having sin in your own life, I would say.
If I am doing something that I'm accusing you of, by the very act of logic, I'm condemning myself. And that's what Paul is saying that the Jews are doing. He's saying they who self-righteously judge others are just as inexcusable as the one that they judge. And that it is not acceptable. And by the way, you know, it's much easier, wrong way to say that. It is, now I'm going to have to read my notes. If I'm in error, it's a lot easier, and I don't want to admit that I'm in error. It's a lot easier for the one that's in error to find the fault out there than it is to find the fault in here. The mote in the eye, we remember that, don't we? It's easier to do that. And the Jews did it, and they did it consistently. There is a principle upon which this condemnation is based. What is that principle? That principle is one of self-condemnation, meaning that it's a principle of common justice. Common sense, common justice. You cannot be justified or correct if you are experiencing in yourself the same sin of which you are judging another. It just doesn't work. For thou that judgest doest the same things. What can you say? Yes, ma'am.
Matthew chapter 7, verse 2 says, with what judgment you judge, ye shall be judged, and with what measure ye meet, it shall be measured to you again.
Yes, ma'am. That does it in a nutshell. Any questions or other comments about this particular verse? It is very enlightening, and it is a good introduction to what Paul is going to follow on with it. If we go to Romans now, to Romans 2. But we are sure that the judgment of God is according to truth against them which commit such things. The judging. Now that appears sort of a, I hesitate to use this, sort of self-explanatory, isn't it? But not quite. Let's look at it for just a moment. Let's, first of all, God's judgment is what? Just. So the things that they're going to be judged by are the things that God has already informed them of, and they should be prepared for that when the occasion occurs. It's always going to be truth, and it's always going to be according to what they've instructed. We have been instructed how to conduct and commit ourselves. It's going to be the real things that happened, and it's going to be not according to, I'm wearing a tie, he's not wearing a tie, he's got on blue breeches, I got on round breeches. None of this foolishness that's going to be applied to it. It's going to be the real McCoy. That's what we are going to be judged on. Against them which commit such things. What does the word commit mean?
Practice.
Excuse me.
Do it, practice it.
Do it, okay? But here again, words. Commit has a connotation of one. And that's not the objective here that Paul is writing about. The word practice would fit better in this, I believe, because you commit it once, you can recover easily. But Paul is referencing the things that they have done to remove themselves from the approval of God, and it is a continual thing. So the word practice, and that is what is used in the Revised Version, by the way. The word practice would fit better here in what that represents, yes.
When you think of the word commit, too, you commit your life to Christ. So it's your
Singular act.
right.
Yes, ma'am.
So you're really into it. You put your whole self into what you're doing. Yeah.
Yes. So they had, the Jews then had been notified. Chapter 2, verse 3. Now, before we look at this, Paul is going to be asking some questions which will contribute to the to the use of those three descriptions about how you might read Romans, depending on how your outlook is. He's going to ask these questions sort of in a rhetorical way or in a self-discussion manner. He's going to ask very pointed questions about disposition, attitudes, and conduct. Then he's going to proceed, of course, to answer it himself like he was having a conversation with himself. He's going to do that through the remainder of chapter 2 quite often. They're very pointed questions, and they are instructive, to say the least. So he begins then in the third verse and says, "And thinkest thou this, O man, that judgest them which do such things, and doest the same, that thou shalt escape the judgment of God?" It's similar to what we just talked about of a few moments ago. But thinking about the possibility of a Judaizing teacher in the Roman church, then Paul is saying what? What we talked about a moment ago. You're smoking a cigarette, I'm condemning you. But I go out back as soon as I can get a break and smoke one myself. But it's like he was thinking that they would think that they are exempt from God's law. They're not going to be called to task about it. But down deep, they were supported in that thought. Now, what time frame are we talking about? We're covering a whole bunch of years in thought on this. I don't know when the Talmud was written. But if you go to the Talmud, you're going to find at least 3 phrases. And they read thus: "Everyone circumcised." Remember, the Talmud is a Jewish book. It's not written to Gentiles. It's a Jewish book. "Everyone circumcised has part in the kingdom to come." So the Judaizer has this instruction or this teaching from one of the basis of his teachings that, and it's not qualified, it just says they're going to have a part in the kingdom to come. It also says all Israelites will have part in the world to come. Same statement, just a different way of saying it. But listen to this one. "Abraham sits beside the gates of hell and does not permit any wicked Israelite to go down to hell." Now that is the attitude that Paul is facing and which he is going to be dispelling in his teaching through the remainder of Romans. Remember chapter 1, 16, 17. They will not escape the judgment of God. Are there any questions or comments about where we are? It's time for us to stop.
I think the Talmud was due to Babylonian captivity and it's a commentary on the Old Testament.
Yeah, okay. So it was before the Babylonian captivity?
No,
During the Babylonian captivity, okay. All right, any other questions or comments? Thank you very much. I appreciate your help and comments.